They told you America was built on freedom. But there's a house in the woods of West Virginia where that word never existed. The walls don't speak, they groan. The floorboards don't creak, they mourn. And inside, something still breathes. They called it a shack, but that's not what it was. It was a prison wrapped in timber. A generational coffin half sunk into the Appalachian dirt. No lights. No records. No mercy. Most people never even knew it existed. And those who did, they looked away. Because what lived inside that cabin was something the American story never wanted to admit, an unbroken bloodline forged from silence, secrecy, and sin. You've heard of inbreeding, but not like this. This wasn't a mistake. It was a system. A closed loop, designed over generations to keep blood pure, isolated, and controlled. No outsiders. No escape. Just the same names, the same DNA, circling back on itself again and again until it collapsed into something else entirely. Something barely human. One of the children born inside this shack never spoke. Not a single word. Another girl was born with eyes so misaligned she couldn't see straight, but she didn't need to. There was nothing to look at. Just vines strangling broken windows and the smell of old rot in every breath. And still, the family stayed. Not out of tradition, out of programming. Because here's the truth they never wanted you to hear. When a family isolates itself long enough, it becomes a kingdom. And in every kingdom, there is a ruler. In this shack, the ruler was fear. But fear wore many faces. Father, uncle, grandfather. Sometimes all three. And the deeper you look, the worse it gets. Birth certificates forged. Medical visits refused. Children hidden from the state. It's not just horror. It's ritualized dysfunction. And it didn't start in this generation. It started decades ago, maybe longer. Before this land had plumbing. Before it had electricity. Before it had laws that meant anything at all. Tonight, we're going inside. Not just the shack, but the truth buried beneath it. You won't walk out the same. And if you do, ask yourself why you never knew about this place. About these people. About the system that left them to rot in silence. The descent begins now. There's something ancient about the way this bloodline folds in on itself, like a snake devouring its own tail. The family in the shack didn't just marry their cousins. They married their doubles. Twins married twins. Cousins became siblings. Brothers became fathers. It wasn't a tangle, it was a spiral, tightening every generation. DNA was no longer a map. It was a curse. And in that spiral, something broke. Gracie Whittaker was the epicenter. Born in a place called Odd, West Virginia. Fitting name. Her parents were first cousins. Their parents were twin brothers. And later, Gracie would marry her own double cousin, a man who was genetically as close to her as a brother. Together, they had 15 children. 15. Most of them couldn't speak. Many of them couldn't read. Several were visibly malformed, twisted spines, slurred movements, blank stares. One could only communicate in grunts. But no one intervened. Not the schools. Not the churches. Not the state. Because this wasn't just a poor town. It was an invisible one. You see, the system that built America also built its blind spots. And in those blind spots, these families multiplied. Not by lust. Not by love. But by legacy. A twisted version of legacy where silence was sacred, and blood was kept close enough to control. There was no rebellion, no running away. Only the shack. Only the rules of the one who ruled it. And here's the part they'll never teach you in school. This wasn't just some anomaly. It was repeated, protected, ignored. From the Whittakers in West Virginia to backroad compounds in Texas, to closed Mennonite and FLDS sects across the Midwest, incest wasn't a mistake. It was a method. A way to maintain order through isolation and domination. You're not supposed to know this. Because once you do, you start to see the pattern. You start to ask the wrong questions. How many families are still out there, locked in genetic cages? How many women were never given names? Only numbers. And why does no one ever knock on the door? So knock with me. But beware. What opens that door doesn't want to be seen. And what waits behind it may not even recognize itself in the mirror. It sits there still, the shack, half collapsed under the weight of time, sagging like an old lung. The front door doesn't swing. It sags. The windows don't open. They stare. No electricity. No plumbing. But the memories? Those never left. Because in this place, the structure remembers. Gracie died in that house. So did several of her children, some without ever speaking a full sentence, some without ever stepping foot beyond the edge of the woods. The walls are soaked in silence. The floorboards warped by generations of bare feet, pacing in patterns older than language. You can feel it in the air, the staleness of repetition, of genes meeting the same genes until the blueprint cracks. But something else lives here too, something not entirely physical. Locals say the house gives them headaches. Wildlife won't come near. Trees on the property grow twisted, as if avoiding the foundation. And in the dead of winter, when the fog rolls thick across the holler, you can still hear the rhythmic thud of someone rocking in a chair that's no longer there. This isn't haunting. It's memory on loop. Because the shack wasn't just shelter. It was control. It was the epicenter of a closed world, where women were not daughters. They were vessels. Sons weren't raised, they were used. And over time, the people inside stopped being individuals. They became echoes. The state never came. Schools never followed up. There were whispers, yes. But whispers die in the mountains. And every time someone asked, the answer was the same: they're just off. Leave them alone. But we can't leave them alone anymore. Not now. Because the shack is still standing, and what it hides has already spread. Maybe not in the form of incest. Maybe not even in the hills. But in our institutions. In our silence. In our willingness to ignore what's too broken to face. Every system that prizes control over freedom breeds its own version of the shack. And every man watching this needs to ask himself one question. What parts of your life have been passed down broken? And what are you doing to stop the cycle? Because if you don't see it, you're still inside the shack. You were told it was just inbreeding. That this story, this horror, began and ended with tangled bloodlines and Appalachian isolation. But that's not the truth. That's a distraction. Because the genetic spiral wasn't the root. It was the symptom. What happened in that shack, and in dozens like it across America, wasn't just a biological accident. It was psychological engineering. The true disease wasn't DNA. It was systemic abandonment, institutional blindness, and maybe something far more intentional. These weren't random accidents tucked in the hills. They were the natural outcome of generations being ignored, intellectually starved, culturally erased, and economically corralled. When you strip a people of knowledge, connection, and power, what you get is a loop, a closed system. One that devours itself. Gracie wasn't the beginning. She was a product. And that house wasn't haunted. It was designed to trap human potential in its lowest form. Obedience, silence, and survival. Now ask yourself this: how different are you? You live in a house with internet, fluorescent lights, and locks on the doors. But are you free? Or are you just another man living in a psychological shack? One built by media. By fear. By generational lies about manhood, strength, and purpose. Because here's the truth they never want to admit: inbreeding creates deformity, but conditioning creates slavery. And if you think what happened to Gracie's children can't happen in a modern mind, look again. Look at men who don't speak, who don't think, who don't leave the digital porches they were born on, who never step into truth, who never question where their beliefs came from. The most dangerous bloodlines in America aren't in the mountains. They're in Congress, corporate boardrooms, and media think tanks. People passing down mental programming, generation after generation. Creating a class that looks free but thinks in loops. Consumes in loops. Dies in loops. This is your moment to break the chain. If you're still watching, comment the phrase, "I leave the shack," twice, right now. Not for the algorithm. For your awareness. To seal the crack you just made in the loop. Because that will not hold back. And after that, you don't get to unknow what you've heard. What if I told you that the incest wasn't just between people, but between systems? You see, when a bloodline folds in on itself, it creates mutations. But when institutions protect themselves from outside influence, reject scrutiny, and marry their own power, they birth something far worse. A self-reinforcing machine of control. Gracie's shack wasn't unique. It was just undisturbed. And that's the part nobody talks about. How quiet the state was. How invisible the church became. How social workers never arrived. You think no one knew? They knew. But they left it. Why? Because letting decay exist in isolated places reinforces the illusion of order elsewhere. It makes the middle-class man feel safe. It lets the bureaucrat say, "That's not us." But it is. It always was. Because neglect is policy when the outcome suits the structure. And while you stare into that dark house in West Virginia, they stare at you from boardrooms and briefing rooms, betting you'll never ask. What happens when the elites inbreed ideas? When politics, media, finance, and medicine all drink from the same poisoned well? Never challenged, never disrupted, generation after generation of identical ideologies, rituals, and symbols. That's incest. Ideological incest. And it creates the same deformities. Groupthink, denial, intellectual dependency, the inability to evolve. Just like the children of the shack who could only speak in grunts, millions of adults today parrot slogans, fear symbols, obey scripts. They don't know how to question, because the very systems meant to elevate them, schools, churches, media, medicine, were engineered to breed compliance, not awareness. And when you try to escape, they call you dangerous, a conspiracy theorist, a threat. Because if even one man leaves the mental bloodline, if even one man questions the shack, the entire illusion cracks. The systems you trusted were never here to help you. They were built to feed on you. That's not hyperbole. That's not theory. That's history, suppressed, redacted, rebranded. And that's why they buried these stories. Why Gracie's descendants were left behind. Because they are the mirror. And if you look too long, you might see the same chains in your own life. See, next, we go to the core, where this all began, and why it never ended. You're almost out of the rabbit hole. But what you see next changes everything. You've come this far. Now let me show you what they never wanted written. Not in textbooks, not in temples, not even in whispers. The origin of it all. The first incest wasn't between humans. It was between gods. Every ancient empire, Sumer, Egypt, Babylon, traced its rulers back to divine bloodlines. Bloodlines they claimed were pure, sacred, untouchable. But those gods, they were family. Brothers marrying sisters. Fathers merging with daughters. Over and over. Not because they loved, but because they needed control. In Egypt, the pharaohs followed suit. Royal incest was law, not taboo. Because if the blood remained inside the circle, so did the power. That's the code. Blood equals power. But power in isolation becomes corruption. And corruption buried over centuries becomes civilization. The same families that ruled Mesopotamia, their symbols still rule today, hidden in logos, currencies, architecture. Obelisks in every capital. Serpent staffs in every hospital. Suns and eyes watching from atop pyramids. You think it's coincidence? It's legacy. Their bloodlines became ideologies. Their thrones became corporations. Their rituals became governance. And just like the shack in West Virginia, they kept the lineage tight. Marrying into wealth, partnering across dynasties, sealing contracts not with love, but with lineage. So while you were taught to see incest as grotesque, they practiced it as strategy. Because generational degradation doesn't matter when the goal isn't life, it's rule. And here's the darkest part. They want you outside the bloodline, but inside the system. You are to serve what you'll never access. Your labor, your attention, your pain. It feeds the same empire it always has. And every time you believe their stories, obey their rituals, repeat their slogans, you participate in a spiritual incest, merging your identity with the very force that exploits it. But now, you've seen it. And there is no going back. Gracie's shack was never just a backwoods tragedy. It was a mirror, showing you what happens when a bloodline eats itself. And what happens when we let systems do the same. The question is, will you stay in the house? Or will you burn it down? Your awakening has begun. You are not like them. You are the break in the chain. The fracture in the bloodline. Comment one last time. I leave the shack. And mean it. Then share this video. Because every man trapped in silence is one revelation away from freedom.